In recent years, there's been a great flowering in memoir literature written by junior officers and soldiers of the Second World War. Much of this literature gives us a deep insight into the difficulties of combat psychology, the behaviour of men in battle. One of the pioneers in this field, Sydney Jary, whose book 18 Platoon has become very well known, supported by the work of Doug Proctor, called Section Commander. This morning I'm going to discuss various aspects of leadership in battle with Sydney Jary. Sydney, could you explain how you were trained to withstand the stresses of being in action and to remain effective under those pressures?
In 1942 and 3, preparing for the invasion of Europe, most of the training was battle school training or training within the battalion. Weapon training was of a pretty high standard, but the question of leadership and grip didn't arise very much. I went into battle thinking that a sound knowledge of weapons and tactics would win battles. Well, it doesn't win battles at all. You suddenly find yourself in a situation where you are the slave of circumstances, and it is actually leadership that wins battle. It's an attitude of mind, and I'm quite convinced that will is much more decisive than skill.
Do you think there's any way in which willpower can be built up by training?
Well, I'm nearly 70, and I don't think I've discovered it yet. I think this is a personal thing. I'm not suggesting there shouldn't be training is most important. You couldn't possibly commit people to battle without the framework of training and discipline. They're absolutely vital. But a large proportion of the population, I doubt if you could do very much with them, because battles are actually won by quite a small number of people there. I would say 10 or 15%. You talk to any experienced battalion, company or platoon commander, and you will find that it is that small cadre of people that actually win the battles. The other people are just there. They'll do, on the whole, they'll do as they're told. I think General Horrocks said something about the battles won by about 15% of the people. Another 60% are there, and the balance would rather not be there.
It sounds as though you're talking about initiative.
Yes, not entirely initiative. The most important thing is grip, which basically is the establishment of authority. Once you've got that, then the junior officer's initiative can operate on a firm basis. If you haven't got the grip, you can't very much well use your initiative.
And is it possible to train people in the art of taking a grip?
By example, probably. It is very difficult, because how do you tell if somebody is going to be good in battle? You can't tell. You don't know yourself. I was quite convinced, being rather an arty type of young man, that I wouldn't be good in battle. I was also, my father was a very keen and very able sportsman. And this had tended to make me think that the Victor Ludorum was the kind of chap the army wanted. Well, it seemed to want it in my day. And also the kind of chap that would succeed in battle. Well, of all the people in my platoon who made it tick, let's run down them. You've met them. My platoon sergeant, Jim Kingston, shy, diffident, a shrinking violet, underneath a man of steel, unshakable. Corporal Proctor, more sparks could be drawn off Doug Proctor, but he was basically a quiet, sensible man. Owen Cheeseman, another section commander, very quiet, extraordinarily determined, and in battle was almost sinister. There's nothing sinister about Owen at all. Joe Thomas, my runner, very religious, said his prayers every night. Extremely brave, but also retiring, and none of them would make politicians, not one of them. The ones to avoid, I found the blusterer. I think this was particularly noticeable with NCOs. The NCOs who blustered, and there was this NCO act. It was in fact an act, but it was more in the man behind that, were jolly good. But the NCO who was purely bluster was no good at all, nor was the soldier. And of course the same applies to officers, and that's worse.
Now, you mentioned that there was a lot of physical training when you were at battle school. Did you find that built up your own self-confidence at all?
Yes, I think it did. I was never particularly good at sport. I was one of those chaps who, when the football was in front of the goal, miskicked, or when at cricket, an easy catch, I dropped it. But I think the running we had to do when I was up to 8 miles in 80 minutes, and I did it with a Bren gun over my shoulder. And I surprised myself that I could do it, because I'm only comparatively small. But that did give confidence. Exercises on the Yorkshire Moors near Ilkley. That gave confidence because you discovered yourself physically and mentally and to some extent emotionally.
Did you find then that you were capable of going beyond what you'd considered to be your own limitations?
A great deal. Yes, a great deal.
Now, you've been mentioning being calm in battle, mentioning your NCOs being quiet. And you do mention that you yourself had a quiet mind in battle. Is that based upon inherited characteristics, or upon training, or some other resource? Where does it come from, this ability to remain calm in the most random and violent and dangerous circumstances?
My mother was quiet and stoical. She was not volatile, so there may be a little inherited. My father was extremely volatile and could go right through the roof. That may have been an example of what to avoid, but I did find, when I first got into battle in Normandy, and really one has got to remember that the bocage in Normandy was just about the best defensive kind of country you could come across. And my first reaction there was, we should have landed in the Pas de Calais. Why land here and come up against all this? Because it was very much the argument in the day, where we were going to land. It was either Normandy or the Pas-de-Calais. And I immediately found that you've got to get enormous grip on the soldiers, because the Germans reacted with far more ferocity than any training that we had suggested. You'd got to get that grip at once, and part of getting the grip was a relaxed and nonchalant demeanour. I found that since I started my own business in the late 50s, and I found dealing with the other directors and staff, that if you never flapped and you had a reputation for imperturbability, rather like Roy Urquhart, who commanded 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, he had that. He had the great advantage of being big. I got to do it by being small. But if you don't flap, if when you're being suddenly mortared you turn around and say, oh dear, we're being mortared, and make light of it, then it diffuses a lot of fears with your soldiers. So I would say, in answer to the question, partly inherited, but I had to learn jolly quickly, and that was learned in the bocage.
Now, you're mentioning that the tactical training at battle school was rather rigid. Was it taught in the form of battle drills?
Yes, it was. I think the greatest problem was it was taught by people who had no experience of battle themselves. It couldn't be avoided because the war had been in North Africa and Sicily and the beginning of Italy. It was almost impossible to get experienced infantry officers back to talk to those of us who were going to invade Europe. From a distance point of view, they'd have to come round the Cape, and no CO would let an experienced company commander or platoon commander away for that. They're far too rare. And they were rigid because of this. It was drill, and I've always maintained it would be far better if it had been taught on a theme and variations concept.
Do you mean principles and their application?
Principles, because one had to adapt and you had to improvise. That was the essence of war in the bocage, adapting and improvising and realizing it was the platoon commander's battle.
I was going to ask you whether you think you were particularly disappointed with the tactical training because of the rather peculiar terrain in Normandy.
I wouldn't say that I was particularly disappointed, because it's a subject I've thought of since, and it is very hard to see how it could have been done better. I think we might have trained more thoroughly for the bocage, but I suppose if we had, and there were discussions of small fields and thick hedges, then there was a security problem in the run-up to D-Day, because nobody knew where we were going to land. Not at my level, they didn't.
Did you find that the tactics you've been taught had a more application later on, when you got out of the bocage area?
To some extent, but not across the Rhine. That was the kind of war envisaged by Liddell Hart and General Fuller. Mobile armoured columns supported by infantry, with the armoured commander running the show until you bump trouble, and then the infantry having to take over. We hadn't practiced that. I think the deficiency was basically in morale, leadership, grip. and it is a very difficult thing to teach.
Now, you mentioned just now that by grip you meant authority. A popular definition of authority is that it is the legitimate power of decision. Would you agree that that is what it comes down to?
I think so, yes. It is that, and also the allaying fears. Grip actually is it's not a come on chaps, follow me. It is a quiet thing. It is the question soldiers ask when they go into battle of their commander is this chap going to win battles and keep me alive? And you've got to let them know that their lives matter to you. After all, at a very senior level, my Army Group Commander Monty felt that this was most important. None of us felt Monty would waste lives, and of course it is very upsetting now to hear him criticised in some circles. In Normandy, you'd think that our aim was to grab real estate and not to tie down the bulk of the German army, which was quite clearly what we were there to do. If he had not followed the tactics that he had, I think he could have wiped out all the British infantry by the end of July 1944. So that kind of knowledge percolating down right to the private soldier is a great morale booster, to know that their officers care.
Would you say that your own grip as a platoon commander was reinforced by the knowledge that more senior officers did have this concern, and that the men had more confidence in you because you were part of a machine that was commanded by a senior commander in whom they had confidence?
I wouldn't think so, because we hadn't really got the measure of Monty that early in Normandy. He'd been in North Africa and Italy. He'd got this great reputation. But we did. At the time, I knew very little about him. It was experience that taught me. Our divisional commander was Butch Thomas, who had a very tough reputation, and I think he would have had the opposite effect. No, I think that this was my discovery in battle in the first week. I suddenly found all sorts of things that I hadn't been taught. I survived, unfortunately, long enough to learn them. And no, this happened within me.
Now, you mentioned that when in battle, soldiers want to be gripped, they want to be directed and to feel confidence in leadership. How do you establish that feeling of confidence and that essential rapport?
I think the best analogy I can give is the conductor of a symphony orchestra. If he gets onto the rostrum at rehearsals with a strange orchestra, he's got the same problem. He's got to put over to the professional orchestral players that he knows his stuff, he knows the score, and he knows what he wants. And he knows what he wants of them. I think you've got to do the same thing, and it's best done quietly. Now, I was very fortunate in having inheriting first-class NCOs. It would be very difficult, if not impossible, without that, because the platoon is a team. It's not like the conductor and the orchestra. You've got your NCOs, but I suppose within an orchestra you've got the leaders of the various sections to help you.
You mentioned a number of factors which contribute to the authority of the leader, and you just mentioned competence effectively. But you also mentioned that the leader of the platoon must show that he has a concern for the welfare of his men, and he has integrity and other qualities. Is there an order of priority in which you'd put these essential characteristics?
I think it varies. I think it's rather like marriage, you know. I think that what individual soldiers want from their officer may vary from man to man. You've got to be mother and father to the platoon and supply all their needs. I think obviously integrity is very important, because they will, a lot depends on that, because they then trust your word, they trust you as a man. What they don't like is some very ambitious person who appears to be earning his spurs in battle, may be rather anxious to win a medal. You'll get people killed and wounded doing that. No, I think they want integrity first and professional competence.
And where does the concern come in? Does that?
Well, that's simply your manner to them. At night time, I used to wander around the platoon. Now the secret is to let them talk to you. Just wander around, come up beside them, and let them talk to you. Then anxieties and tensions come out, and you don't have any problem. Don't go and harangue them. It's not like an American baseball coach.
How would you compare grip as exercised in action to formal discipline?
Well, they're two different things, I think. They interlock. Formal military discipline is absolutely vital, because you are asking individuals to do something that everything in any rational man will rebel against. It's the essential training. Again, may I use the illustration of the orchestra and the conductor? It is the discipline of an orchestra, its professional ability, is then used by the conductor. The platoon commander must transmit a very great deal of emotional energy. It is a question of drawing the best out of your people. And that is very often done in a very quiet way. Again with the conductor, Sir Adrian Bolt, I believe he really did very much more than that. And one of the orchestral players said to me once, it was his eyes. And he was saying to another conductor once, you've just got to pour the juice over them. Well, this all was done very quietly, minimum of gestures with his eyes, but they knew from his behaviour in rehearsal, training, that he knew his stuff, and he gave confidence. I think also soldiers want to be gripped. The survivors of 18 Platoon resent intensely those officers that did not grip them in battle. If they did not seize the nettle in battle, they were really subject to ridicule.
I'd like to come on to the question of the difference now between leadership and command.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, I should start that I never got beyond a company commander. So perhaps I'm not really qualified to say this, but it does seem to me that one requires the same qualities. I've detected in today's army a feeling that command starts at CO, battalion CO level. Below that there's leadership, above that there's command. Well, with the greatest respect, that's nonsense. One's only got to remember that incredible example of leadership when Monty arrived at 8th Army after Auchinleck had gone, and that was personal leadership. He moved in with great charisma, which was not a word we used in those days, and gripped the whole of 8th Army staff. And then he went round the various units, getting a grip at brigade and down to battalion level. During a battle, a divisional commander needs to exert leadership on his brigade commander at times. In fact, I think one corporal in the 8th Army wrote and congratulated Monty on putting up a very good show. And Monty wrote a letter not characteristic of a British Army senior officer at that time, and wrote back and thanked him and said, even army commanders like a little praise at times.
So you're saying the qualities required for command are the same as those for leadership?
Yes, I think they are. They, at platoon and company level, of course, it is far more noticeable, and obviously with a platoon commander there, he has to have a mixture. Command probably is more noticeable until you get into contact with the enemy. And then there's the charismatic leadership that is important.
But the two functions are different, aren't they, even though they're intermingled?
They are. I think, what does a commander need? He needs sound professional ability, perception, a sense of what is practicable, what's on and what isn't on. That comes with experience, of course. Leadership, you're in the realms of sparkle and magic. But that is not to say the commander doesn't need it at times. No, I think it's probably a great mistake to try to separate command and leadership too much. The platoon commander's got to command at times, and he's got to turn on the juice of leadership. And a senior commander has got to command and turn on the juice of leadership as well with his junior senior commanders. It all comes down, I think, to putting on the grip when necessary.
Presumably, the junior commander needs the juice from his senior, so there has to be a cascade from the top to maintain everyone's reservoir of juice.
Yes, that's ideal. But when you are in something like the Normandy Bocage, that cascade of juice doesn't come down onto you very much. You're isolated, and the ball is right in the platoon commander's hand. I think the closer the country, and with street fighting and at night, there's not an awful lot the company and the battalion commander can do once you're involved. Well, wasn't it von Moltke that said that once close contact with the enemy, after 5 minutes close contact with the enemy, all battle plans fall apart? I think that's very true.
I believe he also remarked that the last thing any commander needed was a telegraph wire sticking into his bag, with some remote person at a headquarters far from the battlefield trying to tell him what to do.
Absolutely, because you can't tell. There is practice, or there was in my day in the British Army, that in battle the senior commander has to go forward to the junior commander to consult. Never the other way round. This is absolutely right, because it stops the indifferent junior commander rushing back all the time out of danger to consult. And it also means that the senior commander can get up and see for himself what is going on. It is both practically and psychologically correct.
So he's keeping in touch.
Yes.
It sounds as though command requires intellectual qualities, whereas leadership requires more instinctive and emotional qualities.
Yes, but I think that's an oversimplification. That is perfectly true. Sir Adrian Bolt's comment about pouring the juice on, that is an instinctive emotional quality, and it applies to the platoon commander. But if he gets his small battle plan wrong, and that is an intellectual function, then all will go wrong. It is a balance between the two.
Do you think that you can assume that a good leader will automatically become a good commander?
I'd like to think that, but no. I think a very good example is this is found in the Royal Air Force. You get absolutely first-class, very brave pilots, but they lack that something. It's probably intellectual. It's almost also maturity, I think, that makes a good commander. That can happen in the army. Of course, I'm a good example where it was never put to the test. I suppose I was a reasonable leader, but I was never put to the test as in any command above a company. So I don't know. Perhaps I would never have made a general had I stayed on. It's highly unlikely.
Did you have ambitions?
Not really. No, I didn't have ambitions. There wasn't a lot of ambition about in the army then. You know, promotion was a thing that was done to you. It was rather nice if you got it. But it does seem with a lot of young officers these days there is an ambition to get on. Now, within certain bounds, that's a good thing. But we weren't like that. In any case, you see, I was also an amateur soldier. After the war, I did, for a time, conjure with the idea of staying in the army. But then I changed my mind and got married.
Now, we've been discussing the qualities required of a leader. Do you think that the arts of leadership can be taught or can be developed?
I doubt if they can be taught. But I wouldn't wish to be too dogmatic about this. They can certainly be developed. And I think, bearing in mind the selection process for young officers, it suggests to me that you are choosing people where there's some development possible. And the ones that fail is where there is no development possible. I think development of leadership must come from within yourself. It's a thing that's gained by experience, and the confidence gained by experience. And of course, in that respect, nothing gives you more confidence than succeeding with junior command in battle. I would say that that was the making of me as a person. Before I took command of 18th Platoon in the Normandy beachhead, I was introspective, shy, definitely with artistic leanings. I didn't think that, well, I hadn't heard of grip. It hadn't been mentioned. But if I had, I wouldn't have thought that I'd got it. But a week or two with 18 platoon and winning a few minor battles gave me immense confidence. And not only that, it was the NCOs and the chaps did me a lot of good to find that I was getting their confidence. And that increased my own enormously.
Now, in 18 Platoon, you mentioned that when you first arrived, they were considering you and examining you very, very carefully. How long did it take for you to establish their confidence?
Well, for me, I think Owen Cheeseman summed it up. He said, within 24 hours you were mother to us all, and I think that is a Freudian slip. Not father, mother. And I think in the good leader there are actually some feminine characteristics of patience, perception, and understanding. An extraordinarily masculine type of man is not good at handling frightened soldiers in battle.
Would you say intuition was a quality that was important?
Intuition is most absolutely vital. The Germans have a word, Fingerspitzengefühl. We haven't got a word for it. I think it's literally sensitive fingertips and an ability. I think it has artistic, musical, and certainly command associations. Yes, intuition, perception, and being able to operate from here at times. You know when you put your foot in it from here, not from here.
So this is a matter of instinct, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's being alive to other people's requirements. My wife said once that she felt as an army officer you had got to be alive to the requirements of other people, from recruits to royalty. And I think that sums it up quite well.
Could we go on now to talk about the good soldier, because it's evident that you had a platoon of good soldiers. What are the characteristics of the good soldier?
And a sense of humour is very important. The kind of sense of humour, I suppose really a sense of the ridiculous, which is also a sense of proportion. Patience, sufferance. Now here in the army, I believe you use the term fortitude a lot. I prefer sufferance because far more is thrown at you than as you throw at other people. And you get desperately tired to the marrow of your bones. At times you're hungry, though I would admit the British Army feeding arrangements are probably far superior to that of any army in the world. They certainly were in the European campaign, and I understand they have been in the Gulf. They were the envy of the Americans in the Gulf. We all seem to be able to get hot meals and things like that. That's important. The ability to live with other people, a lack of... The average businessman would make a bad soldier because I believe there's quite a high degree of aggression in business. Life in an infantry platoon in battle is a monastic existence. There's no room for acrimony, there's no room for argument. This is, of course, where films, and particularly television, give entirely the wrong impression. Life in 18 Platoon was very well-mannered, very kindly, And there was a great deal of humour about it. I think without that, if you behaved as officers and soldiers do in films as on television, you wouldn't last 5 minutes because the nervous tension would cause breakdown. You'd only got to hear the Guards Armoured Division on the radio, very genteel. There was always good manners in battle. For a start, a select brotherhood develops, a club, and that club probably covers the 10 or 15% of sensible, stable people who make things happen and win battles. They are very polite to one another. I suppose one understands that if you are not, then you won't get people's cooperation. You're naturally very nice to your gunner and your team gunners and your supporting tanks because you're asking them to do rather nasty things. They in turn are outrageously polite to you. This is most important, actually, that there are these give and take qualities and good manners.
It sounds like the perfect society.
It is the perfect society. My wife was recently taken into a nursing home permanently. On the night that she went in, my platoon sergeant, 2 of my corporals and my runner, who had heard what had happened, had telephoned me. We are very close. Nothing could divide us at all. You've met them. It is a very, very close society. And a film producer met them, a chap named Jack Dennis, who said he was absolutely amazed at the mutual respect. That flows up and that flows down. To Jim Kingston, I'm still Mr. Jary, sir, which can be slightly embarrassing, but to stop him doing it would be hurtful.
You mentioned this quality of sufferance. Does that mean simply the ability to endure anything that happens?
Yes, it covers a very wide range, not only what the enemy does, tiredness, being soaked through, being very cold, being frightened, being in ghastly circumstances like Hoven Woods in the winter, littered with dead. I suppose it also covers keeping one's own counsel, putting on a brave face in adversity. And of course, basically, people who are good at it are not aggressive people. Battles actually are won by people who are not aggressive. Aggressive people are bitter about circumstances and wish to lash back. Well, most of the things an infantry soldier has to bear, you can't hit back about.
You can't hit back at the weather.
Not the weather, not the fact that you can't get food up and ammunition up, and not an enemy you can't reach when he's mortaring you.
And is this the quality that builds the feeling of social commitment to the platoon?
I think so. I think it is. I think that and the knowledge that their commander knows what he's doing and won't ask them to do anything that he won't do himself. And he has good NCOs.
how can you recognise the good soldier before he goes into battle or into campaign where he encounters these hardships?
I suppose it's impossible. One of our gunner officers was Dennis Clark. He's 14 years older than me. He'd been a schoolmaster, a language master. I owe him a very great deal. Now, the commander of the 94th Field Regiment was an old soldier, and a territorial soldier, with an MC that he'd won on the Somme and a DSO at Elst. And Michael Concannon told me that in England, Dennis Clark was his worst officer. When he got to Normandy, he was his best officer. Dennis was imperturbable. It is very difficult to recognise the good soldier. Corporal, Cheeseman, all my NCOs were quiet people, the very kind of people that you probably pass in the street without noticing them. The opposite to the average film star or politician.
Putting the converse to you, are there ways of spotting a bad soldier before going on campaign or into battle?
That's easier, yes. There's normally an underlying bolshiness or resentfulness or cynicism. That's easier to spot than the good soldier. The good soldiers come from the ranks of the quiet, sensible people who don't play their hand. Bad soldiers normally come from your troublemakers.
So you don't want individualists?
No, I didn't say that. Yes, you do want individualists within reason. It's better to have them commanding the platoon, actually.
So you want individualists who are capable of teamwork?
Yes.
Do you think that it's possible to turn an indifferent soldier into a good one by training or by other means?
Very difficult to say. I suspect not. If you mean by indifferent, if you mean a bad soldier, I would think not. No, I don't think you can turn a bad soldier into a good soldier by training. He's bad. He'll probably be bad at anything.
Now, as we know, it is very taxing being on campaign, and even more taxing being in battle, and even good soldiers can be ruined by excessive strain. What can you do to alleviate the effects of the hardships and dangers of campaigning and battle?
That ball is in the platoon commander's hand, because at his level, he knows more about the men than any other officer. It depends entirely on the men. Basically, don't build barriers between you and your soldiers. When I was a cadet, we were told that if we shared, say, a cellar with soldiers, always put up a curtain between yourself and your men. And of course this is nonsense, because in the morning you've probably got to take a spade for a walk in front of your platoon. So where's your dignity then? I think basically you've got to deal with every man according to his needs. Some may lead a little jollying along. Others might, you just walk up to, start the conversation and let them talk. And what's worrying them will come out, providing they trust you. If you've built barriers or you're too high and mighty and rank conscious, it won't come out. And then you'll have psychological troubles. 18 platoon, except for one lance corporal who cracked under very heavy shell fire going into Xanten, and they were extraordinary circumstances. and he'd served long and honourably, and he was very tactfully removed from the battle. We had no trouble at all. It's a thing I was talking about the other day. One hears of battle fatigue after the Falklands and after the Gulf. Now, obviously, there was nothing like the strain in those campaigns than we had in Normandy, but we had no trouble at all. The Americans did. So this may be a thing that is related to discipline, training. I would say basically it's related to attitudes, which cover the lot. The New Zealanders didn't have it. They had their division in the Middle East with a very high morale. They maintained that the reason for it was that if anyone behaved badly, it would soon get back home to New Zealand, which is a very parochial place. The British regimental system may have the same effect.
What are the signs that a good soldier is under an excessive strain?
Silence, probably. Banter and laughing and joking. Drying up. If they don't have stories about NCOs and officers to tell, if that stops, too much seriousness. Tension. With some people you can see it in the eyes. In 18 Platoon I do mention the case of Raven. Now Raven was a very remarkable man. He had landed in Normandy, and by the time we got to Hoven Woods, which I think was in January 1945, he'd really had enough. And he came to me one evening in these ghastly woods. They were littered with the dead of the 5th Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. Winter woods, dripping with wet, soggy ground, quite horrible. And Raven wanted to report sick the next morning. Now, my initial instinct was to say, of course you can't go sick, but I didn't. I was dealing with Raven, a good man, unequipped by nature for war, always done his best. So I simply said, all right, Raven, but just come and see me before you go. Well, he didn't come. It was never mentioned again. You can only wonder what went through Raven's mind that night when he was on stag looking into that dark shadows of that grisly wood, the Germans not very far away. But I know one thing, that in that wood that night a very good man conquered fear. We didn't mention that again for over 40 years.
What were the most terrifying sources of fear that had to be overcome?
Well, this is a very difficult question because basically fear is fear of the unknown. Don't laugh, but I will tell you the thing that has frightened me more than anything in my life, and this was after the war. Serving in Libya, in Benghazi, we had a swimming sports in Benghazi harbour, and I was one of the judges. And at the end of this Saturday afternoon, the soldiers had drifted away from the harbour. We were swimming in one of alongside a jetty, quite a long jetty. Most of the people had gone. The trestle table was being taken down, the 1500 weight was being loaded, and I thought I would have a quick swim myself, and I got into the harbour. And I swam slowly with a very sedate breaststroke. parallel with the jetty. And then I put my head down and looked below the water. And there beneath me was an Italian destroyer, not very far down. Its funnels had been cut off. It had obviously been bombed during the war by the RAF. But there it was, its guns, its boats. And I felt an enormous thump of fear in here. I'm also a bit frightened of the dark. In Hoven Woods, I took a patrol up through the woods. And the trees seemed to be bending down to grasp me. It was almost like a Walt Disney would. And when I got near the German position, I could hear noise, human noise. They were quite noisy people at night. Their discipline wasn't good at night. And that was actually a comfort. So in a way I was more frightened of the almost choreographic situation in the wood than I was of the Germans in Hoven.
The terror of the wild wood.
Yes. Oh yes. But I'm an admirer of the wind in the willows. Yes, it is the terror of the wild wood, and I think that Ratty and Mole were quite right to be frightened with all those stoats and weasels in that wood.
What about your soldiers? Were there particular aspects of battle that frightened them more than others? For example, some soldiers have said that they really didn't like mortars because they arrived unheralded, or that they were particularly afraid of mines because, again, they were concealed. And
yes, the mortaring's the worst, particularly if it's falling on hard ground. That NCO I mentioned that went to pieces at Xanten, we were being shelled by 105s as we were about to enter the town. A lot of them were falling on the road. So they were exploding upwards, and these whirling pieces of shell splinter were coming out, whining past us. The detonation of the shells hitting the road was much louder than if they were partly buried in the fields. Mortaring is the worst, although if there's not too much noise going on, you do hear the mortars pop in the distance, and you can be ready for them. Another nasty one is the 88mm gun, high-velocity gun, firing airburst. You don't hear it coming, and first you know the airburst is over your head. The Germans have got some 88s just north of Eldon, which is north of Elst, south of Arnhem. And they were able to put airburst over the crossroads in Elst. And we used to go from my platoon position across the road to company headquarters, a few at a time, to eat. And scuttling across the road, taking my stew and my rice with currants in my mess tins back to my platoon position. One went off and the piece went straight through the rice, through the bottom of the mess tins. I think also, if you're close enough to a mortar bomb, or a shell or airburst shell, it also, the detonating effect on your head is not just the bang. I don't know that it's blast, but it is that brain-searing, detonating feeling. That does shake you up badly. I find if bullets miss you, I had a Schmeischer bullet go underneath the lapel of my Denison smock. If that missed you, that doesn't frighten you very much. You're almost elated. You almost feel like saying, yeah, I missed.
Do you think that the behaviour of men in battle can be predicted from their behaviour and training?
No, it can't. You get enormous surprises. Particularly with officers. And I don't know why it is officers. I suppose it's more noticeable. I noticed this first with a battle school instructor that I'd known in England. Tall Adonis of a man. He looked absolutely impressive charging in front of a platoon on a battle course. But he went to pieces in Normandy. Now, there's one rifle company that I knew in Normandy. It was commanded for the first few days by a tall, mustachioed warrior, fearsome-looking man. And it didn't work. That company was saved by the second in command of the company, a 22-year-old divinity student, who went on years later to be a vicar. Dennis Clark, who I've mentioned before, is a very good example. I suppose my own NCOs in England were probably people who merged into the background. I think people who were very keen and shone in training and at battle school. People who thrust themselves forward rarely, if ever, did any good. They probably went on to be politicians or something later, but they were a disappointment.
Now, earlier on we were discussing the importance of food, and you mentioned the importance of bringing up hot food to soldiers in frontline positions. I was under the impression that the really important thing was the brew of tea.
It is very important, but the hot meal, at any rate in the winter, is absolutely vital. The British Army arrangements were excellent. We cooked at B echelon, and hot food was put in large thermos containers and brought up, and except in unusual circumstances, Hovan Woods was one. It was a transport problem. Jeeps or Bren gun carriers couldn't get there. Things had got to be brought up on weasels. We got hot food whenever possible. Now, the Americans didn't. The Americans had based themselves on the K ration. It was a cardboard box about the size of a box of milk tray chocolates, and in it was everything. There was meat extract cubes, there was porridge cubes, there was chocolate, there was fruit, there was coffee, there was even toilet paper. But of course the American infantry soldier, except in extremely favourable conditions, wasn't able to feed himself, so he ate these things cold or raw. In the winter battles down near Geilenkirchen, we had an American division in 30 Corps, commanded by Brian Horrocks. And their ability evaporated. And he gave them 24 hours to mend their ways and get hot food. Well, it was extremely difficult because they just hadn't got the machinery to do that. You see, there's more to food than just the hot food or the hot tea. There's also the question of sort of sitting on the edge of your slip trench, dangling your legs, talking to the chap in the next. There's a mother's meeting. Bramley, Hancock and I were sitting, drinking tea. Bramley Hancock was one of our FOOs. When a mortar bomb burst very close to us, we felt the heat from the bomb and we saw the flash. And he casually turned down to me, still holding his mug of tea, and said, "As a gunner, I can tell you that neither of us should be alive now." That was the soporific effect of hot tea on a cold winter's day. No, absolutely vital, and I think the British Army have got their feeding arrangements right. I think that's been proved in the Gulf. I've been told the Americans are very keen to get hold of our compo rations, which I think are still used. We had them.
It's a clear case of morale being based upon good logistics.
Oh yes, I think it is. I don't think the Americans ever, they have always thought you won battles by courage, tactics, the dramatic approach. They didn't realise how important the housekeeping is. The hot food, the clean socks. See, they had nylon in their socks. Gave awful foot trouble. We had pure wool socks and excellent leather boots. We had no foot trouble at all. All these minor housekeeping things, they appear minor. It's a question of, for want of a nail, the shoe was lost.
Did you ever have the opportunity to see German rations or German basic equipment?
Oh yes. They had a rather nice brand of cheese in a thing like a toothpaste tube. Their food wasn't as good as ours. And they had this ersatz coffee, which is quite revolting. The British Army was 1,000% better than anybody about feeding their chaps, seeing that you could keep as clean as possible, providing clean underwear and clean socks. This all tied up with the system of bath units behind the lines. When you went to a bath unit, you got these things.
I haven't really touched upon relations with the enemy. What were your feelings towards the enemy?
Well, they change with experience. The enemy infantry, you had a comradeship with them. In fact, you very often felt rather more sympathetic to them than your own base troops.
Because you were sharing the same hardships?
It was. It's like people in civilian life who possibly been in a bad car crash or a plane crash. There is a bond. And you had that. That doesn't apply to the SS. Rather nasty people. But you did. Prisoners you gave a cigarette to. I was extremely strict about prisoners. I wouldn't have their watches taken, their wallets taken, or their fountain pens taken. Compasses, oh yes. Penknives, you can't let them have a penknife. And military equipment. But in wallets you found photographs of wives, girlfriends, children. You really didn't want to violate that. They were soldiers, and I personally think it's desperately important in the early days of any campaign that you fight a war with soldiers and you don't let it become a rabble. The Burma campaign, of course, prisoners weren't taken on either side. The Japanese set this, and it went on. With many German units, you could have an unwritten understanding. We killed and wounded a number of Germans who put in a bayonet charge at a little village called Sinderen just across the Rhine. When their stretcher bearers came out, we ceased fire. And possibly 10 stretcher bearers were working across our front, 150 yards in front of us. I think one was either one of the officers, he may have been a medical officer, I don't know, but when we had held our fire and the last of them had gone, he turned round and saluted in my direction, and I got up and returned the salute. It all smacks of years and years ago, but it's the right thing to do. Those chaps weren't going to fight another day. It was a very different thing, for instance, when we advanced from Clave to Bedburg. We overran a German platoon position on a railway crossing, and 13 of them ran off to the left across the fields. Jim Kingston's section opened fire, and we killed the lot. Now, they could have fought another day. We actually took 57 prisoners, so it was either a very strong platoon or a very weak company, and they were parachute troops, part of Schlem's parachute army in Operation Veritable. But this question of morality, you see, after the Falklands War, there was all this nonsense about the Belgrano. Now, it would have been highly improper not to have sunk the Belgrano. What would it have done a week later? It was armed with exocets. It was a powerful vessel. People don't understand the morality of war. You walk through a looking glass to another world. I suppose you can't polish your conscience at the risk of your men or other people's soldiers being killed by you're not taking the appropriate action. If you feel that strongly, you should be a conscientious objector. I jolly nearly became one, but it just doesn't work. I suppose the most powerful example of this morality is Bomber Command. Dreadful thing, bombing German cities. But if we hadn't, I am quite convinced we would have lost the war. Early on, it was the only way we could hit back. Later on, how many more Tiger tanks, 88s, divisions of German troops would have got to the Normandy beachhead but for the strategic bombing by Bomber Harris and Bomber Command? We would have lost the war. We would have lost the war to a Nazi-dominated government with the Gestapo to police it. We would have had our United States of Europe then run from Berlin, but Hitler's Berlin. So you've got to fight with everything you've got. But this is not an argument for atrocity. Atrocity can be avoided. Atrocity comes from ill-disciplined troops, not properly led.